Right. All right, Carl Death is the co-host. Thank you all for coming. For those who don't know me, I'm Matt Patterson. I'm the director of SCI, Sustainable Consumption Institute at the University of Manchester. And so I'll be chairing today's seminar, which is centered around the themes of sort of women, water security, sustainability, and peacekeeping. And it arose out of a conversation earlier on within the Institute around a project that Chantal was doing and a visit she made to Senegal earlier in the year, which SCI helped fund. And we had a conversation, say, what might we do out of this? And one of the ideas was a seminar centered around that cluster of themes, and bring a few people together to have a conversation to see where that goes. And so I'm very pleased that we've been able to do this, and thank you all for coming. Just in terms of the process, we're going to start with some very short presentations by 4 panelists, who I'll introduce in a second. And then I might ask a couple of sort of overview questions to the panel, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, and the whole thing will last an hour to an hour and a half, depending on how the conversation goes. It is being recorded, so if you're desperate not to have your picture appear on any recorded Zoom call, then just turn your camera off, that'd be fine. We are hoping to put it up on the YouTube channel that SCI runs as well. The way Natalie Pearl, who's the sort of administrator, has worked it out so that we should be only really recording the people speaking. But nevertheless, if you're worried about that, then just keep your camera off. So we have 4 people going to present as the basis for our discussion. Chantal Bright, who is a PhD student in the Department of Geography. I think reasonably close to completing a PhD, around whose work this sort of, we're organising the event. Her PhD title, at least according to the Geography Department website, it may have changed, of course, is Women, Water Security and Peace in Liberia, an African Eco-Feminist Perspective. And she's being supervised by Ali Browne, who is on the call, the primary supervisor who's in geography, as well as Jonathan Huck and Laura McLeod, who is one of our panelists as well today. Then we're going to have Julien Harou, who is a professor of water engineering at Manchester over in the School of Mechanical or Aeronautical Engineering Division, Department of Mechanical Aerospace and Civil Engineering at the university. And then we're going to have Laura McLeod, who's a senior lecturer of international politics, and one of Chantal's supervisory team, who works on feminist security studies, broadly speaking. She can tell us better what she does. And then finally, Carl Death, who is a senior lecturer in international political economy, also in the Department of Politics, like Laura is, who works on Africa, environmental politics, and development. So it's the idea then is a sort of cluster of different ways in at the sort of where Chantal's work is sort of where lots of those 3 things meet that the other people will speak to. They're each going to speak to 5-7 minutes or so, and then we'll take the conversation from there. So I think that's enough from me, and I'm going to hand over to Chantal to start us off. So I think you have some slides, Chantal.
Just a quick one, Matt. Sorry. There's a fire alarm in ALB. So Carl has currently left the building and will come back when he can. So maybe we can hear him last.
Well, Carl is last anyway, so hopefully
good, yeah.
he will either join us in some sort of 21st century way on his phone, or they'll be back in Arthur Lewis by then. Laura's clearly at home rather than Arthur Lewis. Thanks, Natalie. Okay, Chantal, I'll pass you the floor. You're muted, Chantal.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to give a brief overview of my PhD research and talk about which stage that I am right now. So this is pretty much like a work in progress talk. Okay, this is the overview of my PhD research. So my research looks at the water, gender, and peace nexus in conflict-affected Liberia. And just to state my positionality, I am Liberian American and a direct descendant of the freed slaves who returned to Liberia and very much was the elite ruling class of the country up until 1980, when the first conflict started to ensue. These are my three questions. The first question goes to the challenges that women face in collecting water. Gender-based violence is, gender-based violence is prominent in Liberia because of wartime rape. And it's something that continues on. So I wanted to look at how women are being, what are the challenges in reducing gender-based violence linked to water access. My second question goes to land rights and women's participation in land governance, because water access is linked to land ownership and property ownership. Land ownership and property ownership is a conflict driver in Liberia, but water access is not. It's more of a risk multiplier, which is the case in when we're talking about water and peace and security. Water is rarely a direct cause of conflict, but it is a risk multiplier. My third question goes to how women can organize, how Liberian women organize for peace and how they can respond to the water security challenges in Liberia. Liberian women used a very radical form of peace intervention during the conflict. And I'm trying to look at how, what the role of women in not just maintaining peace in Liberia, but also how they can respond to sort of the water security challenges. I'm using like mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative methods, and these are some of the methods that I'm using. Currently, I am at the Liberia Congress looking at some archives, doing some data collection and archival work, because Liberia's history is very much, or its pathway to modern statehood is very much embedded in American history. I'm going to talk a little bit about that when I give a brief overview of Liberia. These are the fast facts of Liberia. The American Colonization Society, which was a private organization founded in the U.S., formed to repatriate freed Black people back to Africa. And this wasn't a novel thing. Britain had done it previously next door in Sierra Leone, so this was just the U.S. response. Liberia is Africa's oldest republic, is one of two African countries on a continent that wasn't colonized. Currently a population of 5 million, just over 5 million. They, after having a civil conflict from 1989 to 2003, they elected the first female head of state in Africa, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. And then there was an Ebola crisis in 2014. Currently, the current administration is a world-renowned football player, George Weah. So when you think about water problems in Liberia, people rarely think about water problems in Liberia because it's such a wet place. But the problem is in Liberia around water is like potable water. So this is just some fast facts around like the overview of the water resources in Liberia. There are two main seasons in Liberia. Half of the year is a dry season and the other half is a rainy season. During the dry season, it's really dry, so the proportion of rainfall is significantly reduced during the dry season, which causes a huge problem. Groundwater quality is threatened by unprotected wells and contamination. We also have climate change seems to be another factor that's going to like increase rainfall and also increase the risk of waterborne diseases. For the longest time, Liberia did not have a single entity that managed its water system. So it was divided between the 8 different entities. They've only just created an act in Congress in which they're going to develop a single entity to deal with the water regulatory. But at the moment, they haven't really taken over all of the water sector responsibilities. So when I talk about water security, I'm specifically talking about policy and water management. There's many definitions that deal with that define water security, but this is the most acceptable one. Water security is a reliable availability of an acceptable quantity and quality of water for health, livelihoods, production, coupled with acceptable levels of water-related risks. So mainly, a lot of my work will look at policy and management in Liberia. These are some of the factors contributing to water insecurity in Liberia. Pollution, the water quality, poverty is a main one, mismanagement. Because of the longstanding war, a lot of the skills and expertise left the country. So, and of course, lack of infrastructure. The country is still struggling to rebuild post-conflict, even though the war ended in 2003. One of my questions, I just wanted to just before I close, I wanted to show just this passage from the work that I'm doing currently at the Library of Congress. As I mentioned before, the American Colonization Society, which repatriated Black people back to Liberia. They had a journal, which is the African Repository. So much of Liberia's history is founded in this journal. This journal is no longer running, but because I'm looking at land access, and I'm looking at land and property rights and gender, and the system, we have a duality system where it's customary law and customary law and statutory law. And so I wanted to trace back this idea of land ownership. So this is a passage when they were trying to recruit Black people to return, to go on the voyage and return to Liberia. This was the passage that they had, like an advertisement. And I'll read it because it's not really clear. The industrious and worthy people of color, desirous of removing to Liberia, the American Colonization Society will give you a passage and a subsistence on the voyage made in about 40 days. In support for the first 6 months after landing, single adult persons get 10 acres and families 25 acres of land. These are all gifts, never to be repaid. Those wishing to remove to Liberia should make application addressed to William Coppinger, corresponding secretary and treasurer of the Colonization Rooms, Washington, D.C. As you can see here, the American colonization has already started. They're purchasing land and promising land to those being repatriated. So I'm just trying to trace back this idea of land ownership and how and how this will affect water access in present day. Thank you.
Brilliant, great start. Thank you, Chantal. We'll pass over straight to Julien, who's next. I think you will have some slides as well, Julien. So there we go. Thank you.
Okay, can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thanks for having me on this. Really quick. So it's good to be here. I'm in the engineering department, and so we tend to analyze water river systems, and they could be developed. But that's the water conflict. So it's a different scale. That what we just heard from Chantal. This is more at the country scale or at the multi-country scale. But it's also about water and conflict, so it's a completely different perspective. A lot of this work is based on this Future Dams project we just finished. It was a flagship University of Manchester GCRF project that involved all these multidisciplinary efforts, all these fields trying to work on how to assess water systems that are linked to energy and food and environment. So we have all these academics and all these case studies. So I'm just going to show very, very few results today just to give you a background. So really what this is it's a human natural system design approach, which we try to base that on the understanding of the system, the engineering, the environment, economic performance of different ways of investing in and managing water and sectors that link directly to water. Then after we that can take several years to be able to simulate on your computer how the system actually works and how benefits are generated throughout over space and time in a country or in even a group of countries. Once we can do that reliably, then we do a second phase, in which we use computers to search for good development. So in any country, in any region, there's a whole number of different options, investment options or policy changes that are being considered. And one of the challenges of complex human natural systems is that there's billions and billions of different ways you could develop and invest in the system. And so how should you select amongst those? So that's really what we do, and we reveal the trade-offs in the most efficient packages of solutions. That's the phase two. And then the last one is really deliberation, and we interact with different stakeholder groups and negotiators and decision makers. And then we often iteratively go back through stages 1 and 2 until we can try to make sense of how the system might be developed. So visually, it looks like this. The simulation is just computer-based accounting. We represent space and time and look at how benefits accrue as week by week, dozens of years, how the system is managed. So simulation is just counting the benefit of the volumes of water over space and time. The searching is it's a multi-objective search. We consider different metrics. Like here, I'm looking at an example of buying a house. You plot the distance to work and the cost, and you can see that there's an efficient set of houses that for any distance to work are the cheapest house. And so that what we call the efficient set is what we look at, and we recommend those high value solutions to stakeholders. So we obviously don't do that in a real estate problem. We do that for a complex human natural system. And then the deliberation is we're interacting with stakeholders, and we're looking at those trade-offs and trying to help them understand that if you take different packages of investment options, these are the kind of benefits and the trade-offs that they imply. This is a case study that we did long ago, around 2015, but I thought it was a nice example. There was an international funder that was considering all these different dams in the Republic of Congo, and they were Brazzaville, and they were the question was, should we build one dam? Should we build many smaller dams? How should we intervene in this natural system, which had a few people living, loss of wildlife as well? And so we considered where people were living, where the migratory fish, the level of blockage of migratory, where we had interesting wildlife. And then we did this analysis of the different options and looked at their different performance levels. And so I won't be able to get into detail on these plots, but we created these interactive plots that look like this. So here you can see across the top, there's all these metrics or these performance metrics that we cared about. And each line represents a package of investments. So depending on how you feel about those different performance metrics up top, you can choose a line which represents a different package of investments. And so this can be, this is an interactive plot that you can put on the internet. And here you can see you're filtering, you have the energy ministry who says, oh, you need to produce at least this number of megabytes or megawatts rather. And then the Ministry of Finance, which tells you, well, you're only getting $3.5 billion. So this allows you to filter down and to get a relatively small number of lines that represent different packages of investments that have different characteristics according to these performance metrics that are on the axes. And so that's visually how it works. Through Future Dams, created these web platforms to allow to do this, both for systems on the left and on the right on combined water and power systems. And I'll finish just by showing some other case studies that we did. We're now using this in the Tigris-Euphrates region. So here is a screenshot of one of these online modeling systems that allows to assess different investment and different policy changes throughout this 4-country river basin, which of course is very interesting and has a history of conflict. So we're hoping to be useful there. We're also doing this in the 11-country system of East Africa, the whole Nile River basin, and we're using the same methodologies to look at how different dams, different proposed investments across both water and energy would impact the benefits to the different users. Here's a final example from Africa. This is a study on the combined water and energy system of Ghana, and we're doing still the same thing. We're simulating the combined water, energy, food, environment system and looking at how different package of future developments would affect how benefits are distributed between regions and between sectors. And there we go. That was it for me. Sorry, I went 1 minute over. Looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
No, that was great. Thank you. Do you want to? Oh yeah, there you go. Next we have Laura. I think it's clear that the strategy of getting diverse in interventions is going to become is already clear. But Laura, go ahead.
Hello everyone, I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Matt actually started off by talking about 5 themes, and he said how today is structured around women, water, security, sustainability and peacekeeping. And so just to make it clear, my own research covers women, tick, water, not really, security, tick, sustainability, not really, peacekeeping, sort of. I actually do peace building because I view peacekeeping as being sort of like the military activities that you do, while peace building is actually the creation of a peaceful society. So just to make it clear, that's how I view my research agenda. And I'm obviously one of Chantal's PhD supervisors. She's also been supervised by Ali Browne and Johnny as well. Okay, so as I said, my research in kind of at the moment, it focuses on gender and global governance, and specifically peace building indicators and how we measure gender and peace. And I'm also looking at networks of gender experts and how gender experts are connected to each other. I also define my work as being very much a sort of feminist and peace and conflict study and grassroots and transnational women's organising. I'm really interested in how women's NGOs work and what actually creates a sort of like what women do together, yeah, and also feminist security studies, yeah. And so this kind of constant throughout my whole research career, actually, for the past scary amount of years, 20 years, has very much been the women, peace and security agenda. Now, the women, peace and security agenda is a global policy framework that influences how we respond to gender-related crises in international peace and security. And this whole agenda started with what we call United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, and there has been a further 9 Security Council resolutions. And these resolutions create a framework for accountability within the UN system in particular. It is potentially radical. How radical it's been is up for debate, but the resolutions are seen as a potentially radical intervention into a very conservative global governance institution, the United Nations system. And the Women, Peace, Security agenda has also been heavily adopted by states. We see a lot of national action plans, for example, and NGOs, both grassroots and international NGOs, have also used the Women, Peace, Security agenda to actually shape what work they do, but also as a platform for making their concerns heard. So all of my research kind of is based, if you like, around that. Then you will notice that I haven't made any mention of water. I make no apology for not being an expert on water. And in fact, I want to kind of reflect a little bit on the relevant aspects of discussions about water, within my kind of research areas, and specifically in the kind of relevant aspects of water when we talk about international peace and security. Okay. So the theoretical influence is like the cat got his scratch in the sofa. Anyway, the theoretical influences for my own research area, feminist security studies and feminist peace and conflict studies, does not look at water insecurity and conflict affected areas very much, and certainly hasn't given very much consideration to environmental or sustainability issues until very recently. And I think it is really surprising, given that resource instability in conflict affected areas goes hand in hand with gendered insecurity. So why is this the case? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer you 2 reasons why they hadn't been discussed much in my own area, and then reflect on where there are connections being made and why it might actually be valuable to kind of foster and encourage these connections. Okay, but why are these connections between resource instability and gender insecurity not being made? The first, I would say, the disciplinary heritage of feminist security studies and feminist peace and conflict studies in particular. Both are actually responsive to the marginalisation of feminist and gender concerns within security studies and peace and conflict studies in particular. And with these responses kind of emerged in the 1980s and early 1990s. So in a way, you have these feminist ideas are actually a reaction to, and a response to, a sort of much more institutionalized ideas about what constitutes peace and conflict studies and what constitutes security studies. And the kind of grand narrative that we do, that we just cannot resist retelling, where this idea that security studies emerges out of strategic studies, and strategic studies date from the Cold War, and it's this kind of response to the sort of concerns that we might have had about the use of nuclear weapons during the Cold War. And I think that what this does is that it actually kind of created, if you like, 2 fields that responded to essentially extremely militarized concerns. And what feminists were doing was actually reacting to that agenda and saying, oh, we need to do research differently, or we need to ask different questions, or what was the feminist perspective, for example, on nuclear weapons look like? And I don't think any of this is wrong, but what I do think it does is it actually creates sort of disciplining effects. They actually prevent the kind of new issue coming into the discipline. And even now, what counts as the subject of security, what we might cover, for example, in my level 2 security studies course, has actually shifted enormously. But even in the very design of these courses, we still see the reinforcement of this grand narrative. And I can speak, you know, from experience here, is that I have been engaged in a 2-year project to try and transform the content of the module, and it's been very hard because there are no textbooks, for example, and there are no readers that we can draw on that easily refer, you know, kind of depart from that grand narrative. So it kind of raises questions about how we actually teach the content in that material of security studies and kind of escaping the kind of disciplinary narrative. But I think that had an impact because I think it kind of exploded any sort of like discussion of water. We do have environmental security. That kind of become a very new thing, and it's actually saying instead of it being sort of a cross-cutting issue, it's actually being here. We'll do a week on environmental security kind of thing. It's being isolated, if you like, from other security concerns. I don't think this is just merely academic, because I've actually seen it also happen with an international organisation, international institution. And this gives me my kind of second reason why I think the issues are not covered much in my field. It's the international institutions and their funding specifically. And the funding is important. Your line between post-conflict and development, and how this means certain linkages kind of fall through the gaps. And I was going to kind of say who this interview was with, but I can't because we're recording it. But just I had an interview with a senior gender advisor, one of the Washington DC-based development organisation. She said that several countries actually consider it as an insult to be called a development context or to be called a post-conflict context. And so that actually shapes what kind of project and what kind of intervention they can do in these areas. And again, I think given that water insecurity kind of had a sort of heritage, if you like, in development studies, I think that kind of prevents it from being a cross-cutting issue again. So there is an indication, if you kind of draw that line and that boundary between naming the country as a post-conflict context or a development context, then it affects what budgets are used, what budgets are drawn on, what projects and what agendas matter to that context. So in the recent years, there have been some noises about the importance of climate change and environmental crisis in relation to the Women, Peace, Security agenda. One of the Women, Peace, Security agenda, Resolution 2242, published in 2015, made mention of climate change, recognising that the impact of climate change is part of a changing global context of peace and security. And it reinforced that Women, Peace, Security is a cross-cutting subject, right? i.e. that climate change as a peace and security concern needs to be gendered. And I think it's kind of a positive move, and we can see some traction already. So there are increasing mentions of climate change in the annual Secretary General report. That every year there is a report by the Secretary General of the United Nations about women, peace, security, and now there's a little section somewhere in that report on climate change. There is more interagency programming, specifically between the United Nations Development Programme and the Department of Political and Peace Building Affairs. And the third, I would say, is the there was a restructure of the UN system in 2019, while the Department of Political Affairs, which is, if you like, the mediation, the peace mediation arm of the United Nations, and that was restructured to be the Department of Political and Peace Building Affairs. And that kind of changes the range of issues that they could cover. And so actually all of these kind of changes actually facilitate the possibility of more connections being made. But I would argue that it's still not very concrete, and the emphasis is still being placed on the need to increase awareness and integrate concern rather than here is a concrete action plan. And I've also noticed as well that the discourse is very much on climate change rather than water insecurity. And I'd like to throw that out to you as a question to all of you about what the importance of that distinction is and what kind of effect it has. But what are the potential of making these connections, and why should we foster these efforts? And actually that kind of question is one of the reasons why I was very happy to take on Chantal project at a PhD to supervise, because I thought that she was actually kind of beginning to make these connections. And I thought about this in relation to peace processing, and specifically the design of the final peace agreement. One of the things that I've done a lot of research in the past, by the way, on peace agreement. So one of the things that I found about the Dayton peace agreement, which agreed for peace in Berlin and Copenhagen, was that a lot of women felt that if they had been included, they would have actually designed into the peace.
I think we've just lost Laura. Is that right? Ah, that's annoying. I think we should pass on to Carl, and then when Laura gets back, if she's got any last minute things to say, she can do that. But we've got a very definite sense of how she's engaging these sets of themes. But yeah, Carl, let's pass over to you, and then we can pass back to Laura when she gets back if needed, or we can just bit that into the conversation.
Okay, thanks, Matt, and thanks very much for inviting me. I'm sorry Laura got cut off there, but what I've got to say maybe follows on quite well. We're both in the politics department, and so concerned with similar questions of power and knowledge, although in a different area, because my research focuses on the politics of sustainable development, and in Africa specifically. I've done most of my research on Africa, informed by critical theory perspectives, including things like governmentality and counterconducts and political ecology. Most of my research has been on and in South Africa, so I've got a few examples I can talk about there, also in Tanzania and a bit on Nigeria as well. I was actually an external examiner 2 weeks ago for a PhD on climate politics in Liberia, so I have a new interest and appreciation for environmental issues in Liberia, and so it was really interesting to hear what Chantal had to say. The bits that I caught when I wasn't outside for a fire alarm, but I was listening on my phone, so I got a bit of it. I'll try and keep it fairly brief. I'm gonna say something about my previous research and then the project that I'm working on at the moment. I will get in a little plug for my last book, which was called The Green State in Africa, which was arguing that the governance and contestation of environmental politics, including issues related to land and water, has been at the heart of how states are produced in Africa. For example, one of the chapters on biopolitics looks at how populations are governed through environmental discourses, which have often tended to represent Africans as either environmentally degrading rural peasants, or as wasteful urban consumers, or as dangerous others, as foreign bodies, as transgressive bodies. And one of the really good examples here is South Africa's policies on domestic water consumption and conservation, where the imposition of water meters and attempts to implement cost recovery as well as water conservation has hit poor and racialized communities particularly hard. There are really intense debates about water politics in South Africa, and of course the impact of this has been profoundly gendered as well, and this became incredibly important during COVID, where simple measures such as hand washing were much harder and more complex in the context of informal township settlements than in affluent white suburbs. I think it's probably fair to say that the book doesn't focus as much on water as it should or could. I'm not a water researcher primarily. We could talk, Laura sort of touched on this as well, but we could talk about what might be described as the land bias in much environmental politics or development research. But there is, thinking about this in terms of South African politics, there is a lot to talk about. Issues of water resources and marine biodiversity are highly politicized and never far from the press attention, both in terms of water privatizations and cutoffs in township settlements. There's been recent debates around permits for offshore mining, and of course, South Africa hit the global headlines with reports of an impending day zero in Cape Town in 2017, 2018. Day zero being the date at which, the impending date at which municipal water supply was due to be cut off, and citizens were going to have to queue for their daily ration of water. It never actually got to the point of day zero. The city implemented significant water restrictions and succeeded in reducing daily water usage by more than half, but the impacts on agriculture, on food supply, on public health, on childcare, on fire safety and things like this were incredibly significant. Just a few words then about my current research. I'm looking at how future climate change policies and societies are being imagined in Africa. And one aspect of this looks at policy visions, for example, net zero by 2050 policy visions. In the research I've done so far, which has been on South Africa and Nigeria's long-term strategies, it seems that water is a peripheral concern at best. In South Africa's long-term vision, water is really only mentioned in passing as part of the context of, given how water scarce South Africa is and is projected to be. In Nigeria, there is quite a large hydropower sector, so that's quite significant in terms of renewable energy. And the long-term vision does have a two-page discussion of freshwater and coastal wetlands, but this is fairly descriptive. So the other dimension of my current research is to look at how future climate change societies are being imagined in African science fiction, short stories, novels, and films. And I hadn't written about this particularly, but given this seminar, I was thinking about the ones that I've been engaging with and the watery themes that come out in some of them. And the two that leapt to mind were, there's the novel Lagoon by Nnedi Okorafor, and there's a short independent film, Pumzi, by Winuri Kahui. And these are both being read as African futurist, eco-feminist stories about water and gendered power relations, shifting conceptions of family, and transformed human and non-human relations. So the novel Lagoon opens with an attack on an oil pipeline in the Niger Delta by a swordfish, told from the perspective of the swordfish, and which was apparently, the author says, it was inspired by reading a news story about about an event, a real event in Angola. And Pumzi is set in an apocalyptic East African landscape after the water wars, in a technologically advanced and sealed community in which water is obsessively measured and recycled. And the central character breaks the rules, leaves the compound into the irradiated wasteland outside, carrying some precious water and a seed that she's taken from the compound. And in the final scene, she plants the seed, lies down in the desert, shelters the seeds from the sun and wind, and allows her own body moisture to nourish the plant. And so in my current research, I'm really interested in reading these cultural texts alongside official political visions and strategies to try and think and explore alternative ways of imagining future subjectivities and relationships and knowledges and politics. So I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. Thank you, Carl, and thank you all four. Sorry about Laura. Laura, apparently her computer decided to that it didn't want her to play, and it decided to start doing updates right in the middle of while she was talking. I think if you're okay, Laura, we'll just keep going to the discussion. Anything you missed in your presentation, you can you weave in as we go. So I thought, in terms of process, I will just say a couple of things to kick off the discussion. But if other people in the audience have got questions they want to prepare, then go ahead. If you would rather put them in the chat than say them out loud, then feel free to do that as well. If you're feeling like you'd rather do it that way, that's okay. I can relay those questions and we can all see them as well. But otherwise, you can use the hands up function as well, and I'll be able to see that. The one thing that I found quite, I mean, it's always intriguing, and in some ways it's one of the things I've quite liked since I've been at Manchester. There's many things that have been intensely annoying. That's the same everywhere, and certainly over the last 6 years. But one of the things I like is that we do have quite good capacity to work across interdisciplinary things in this way. SCI is quite a good place for that. Geography is a very good place for that, where Chantal's doing her PhD. And I think we've just seen that. But it's also inevitably quite a big challenge. So I was really struck by, on the one hand, the question in a way is, what is the relationship between how we think about the sort of the socio-technical characteristics of providing water, which Julien sort of in particular sort of gave a vision of in terms of how engineers thinking about in these large development projects think about mapping water supply, planning it forward, and so on, versus the more sort of explicitly political, social questions about water, gender, power relations, and so on. And it's there's lots of sort of interesting points of contact, I think. So one for me, for example, was I was wondering when Julien was talking, like, the point that Chantal ended on about who is getting given the land, where the rivers are presumably passing through, who owns that land, what are the property relations, how might that be modeled in to the technical things, because that might also be who actually makes the decisions about how land and water is being used on a daily basis in lots of places. As an aside, I was really struck by your point about in that one about from the Colonization Society, Chantal, about how much land they were getting given and the model itself, because that model of colonization is more or less identical to what was going on in the United States at the same time, and Canada, right? Colonists moving gradually west were being given plots of land, and that's exactly how it, and a little bit and 6 months worth of sort of resources to survive on until they could, get the crops or the, but at least in Western Canada, they were getting given 200 acres, not 10 acres. So there's quite a mismatch there. I mean, it's also how big the Western United States and Canada are, but nevertheless, that struck me. So I think there's an interesting question there. I'd wonder about what the panel think about. How do we get those conversations from the sort of technical details of water provision, where a dam might go, how irrigation systems work, and the political questions about who wins, who loses, who controls the decisions. I was also struck, another thing that struck me across that interdisciplinary divide was, in some ways, and this might sound really odd to some people, the real similarities between what Carl was talking about as sort of at the level of science fiction, Afrofuturism in those novels, and actually thinking about the engineering and the modeling that Julien was talking about as also imaginative futuring exercises, right? Thinking about ways that the future might unfold. Very different ways of doing that, clearly, but in some senses not actually that far apart about imagining the future and thinking about as a heuristic device for thinking about what might happen. So that was sort of that connection struck me as quite interesting. The final point I'll make, and see if anybody has got any reactions to this, is about the point that Chantal started with, in a way, although no, again, it's the point you ended with, right? Essentially going back to the establishment of the Liberian state by going into the sort of US Congress, US archives about those decisions and how that process unfolded. The point about peace building, and Laura's correct, correcting of me, because about peace building rather than peacekeeping, and Carl's book on the Green State, those are all slightly different moments in thinking about what is the relationship between water and land, sort of intertwined with each other a little bit, perhaps, and the process of building states on an ongoing basis, right? That's more or less the fundamental point in Carl's book, is that, doing environmental management, even in the simple concept, even in the questions of and very clearly the building of dams, in Africa, that in lots of African countries, the building of dams has been absolutely central to post-independence state building. I spent the first year of my life in Ghana, and that was exactly in the mid-60s when all those massive, not the Aswan, that's Egypt, a series of massive dams in Ghana were being built exactly as that development project to unite the whole Ghanaian state after independence. And so I think there's another interesting thing there about how the technical things that are embedded in lots of what Julien was saying are really close, are much more closely connected to the social processes that Chantal and Laura and Carl suggested. So that's a little pitch. But the general question I'd love to hear a bit more about is, how would you see the connections between these sort of the more engineering, the more natural science, the more technical aspects of thinking about water development, security, and these more political questions across this sort of these quite wide, what at least first seem quite wide interdisciplinary divides. Ali's going to say geographers think about this all the time, which is fine. and she's right. But for the rest of us, how do we think about that? So Chantal, I don't know, I'll pick on Chantal because it's your event as much as anything. So have you got any thoughts about how you think about that sort of interdisciplinary question in relation to your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think about that a lot. I talk about in Liberia context of lacking the infrastructure and the skills, the technical skills, the infrastructure, the money, the funding that it takes to produce this in post-conflict settings. Poverty is a huge problem in getting water access for the state issue and for the individuals. So think about that a lot and how to finance water, looking at technologies to, for example, like rainwater harvesting, things like that, looking at the existing resources that we have and how we can use technology to advance that. So that's one of the ways, but more importantly, how can you finance those things? How can the state finance this? What are the relationships between like PPP agreements and how the state plays in that? And what does that mean for civil society in general? So yeah, I do think about that a lot, especially in the post-conflict reconstruction building phase of conflict-affected countries. I don't know if anyone else wanted to add to that.
Has anybody else on the panel got any thoughts on how you, I mean, Julien, you're clearly at one level working in interdisciplinary context. I saw David Hume's name, so you're working with people in GDI and so on already. But how do you find negotiating that challenge in between different disciplines around issues like this?
Yeah, so thank you. I think we definitely struggled and worked on that quite a bit in the Future Dams project, which was led from GDI with David Hume of the Global Development Institute. It's clear that even though I showed a sort of techno-economic approach to evaluating projects and investments, it's quite clear that the part of the complexity comes from that it's a deeply social, political process, and a governance process, really. And so, we're trying to improve the way decision makers can compare different packages of interventions based on how they redistribute benefits between different regions and different sectors and potentially different social groups. So, although I didn't dwell on it, it's definitely a very, the interface with politics is pretty direct. And that's why, I would say what I presented is not the way it happens in the real world. In the real world, it's not this kind of transparent, rigorous, techno-economic evaluation approach, but it's more traditional, politicking, which determines how resources are allocated to different social, regional, or sectoral economic and social groups. So I think the interface is very interesting, and we should definitely deepen it. We of course, as engineers and economists, we have to, we stay quite dry and just practical advice. But it's quite clear that the way that advice can be embedded within governance processes and within political processes, is a very interesting and open question. So I'd welcome being able to engage with colleagues on this. Thanks for the question.
Thanks. Laura or Carl, do you want to say anything on this, or should we? We're happy to go to Q&A if you want, but Laura's nodding her head.
I think that a big part of it could actually potentially be down to funding and how we frame issues. So how we can cross these divide. The funding, Julien, I was quite struck, but I think you might have actually mentioned it, I thought almost like a throwaway example, but you talked about how that only, I think it was 3.6 billion you mentioned, but the fact is you were talking about billion, and it just struck me at that point is that all the people working on the Women, Peace, Security agenda, I know, would love to be talking in terms of billion or only billion. A big part of it is that in order to better make the connections between water and security, women and peace, we need more money. So I'd say that's a big kind of issue as well. And Matt, again, what you were saying you talked about how post-colonial states and a big sign of post-independent state building was to build all those dams. And I thought that was really interesting, because you could, maybe somebody's made this point in the past, but you could actually talk about dams as a figure of masculinity, of a kind of masculinized version of state building. And I might think actually about how you could potentially go down the route of talking about state building as something that needs to be owned by the community, and actually thinking about how can we create opportunity for grassroots community involvement, and actually thinking about who is involved in all of these processes. Because I think sometimes when we talk about community processes, there's a tendency to say, oh, we will have those tribal men, for example, involved, and that's not necessarily the most productive way forward. And that's actually quite hard, by the way, I think, for international organisations to conceive of and develop projects that can actually be rooted down and emerge from community, because of the way that we demand outcomes and the measurement of outcomes. So, yeah, I think there are three kind of incoherently presented ideas there. The first, more money. The second, how we frame and involve people in issues. And the third is thinking about how international organisations might have demands for particular kind of outcomes or output that might limit what can be done. By the way, I was also going to say I was very close to finishing anyway, so you didn't really massively miss much anyway. All right then, thank you.
My only sort of slight joke at the end of that is that part of the point of my interdisciplinary pitch there, and I think in some ways both, you know, from a SCI point of view, sort of at least how we see ourselves, correctly or otherwise, is that maybe that you get your big grants because your next grant might come from EPSRC, not ESRC, and that, you know, because they have more money anyway, and they have strong interests in, or strong imperatives to get these sorts of interdisciplinary cross social science, natural science boundary projects going anyway. Carl, do you want to have a quick intervention? Then we've got one question, then we can switch over to other questions, and I see Ali already.
Okay, yeah, very quickly, because the interdisciplinary point is such a key one, and it's a key thing for development studies and environmental politics. And it was actually my first engagement with the politics of water and water security were at my previous institution, where they were putting together an interdisciplinary teaching program on food and water security in between crop science, geography, some engineering faculty, and international politics. It was really interesting and sometimes frustrating, but ultimately really rewarding and productive thing to be involved in. It produced perhaps interdisciplinary students, but it didn't produce interdisciplinary staff, because we were working in our silos, although I did get the opportunity to teach food and water security. In attempts to think about interdisciplinary research, I mean, there's clearly so many areas of mutual interest across disciplines, but in my experience, the process of trying to formulate research questions that make sense across disciplines can be one of the most challenging aspects of it, particularly when you're coming from different epistemological perspectives and critical and problem-solving approaches. But I do think, as Matt suggested in his comments, that in the more recent stuff that I've been doing around imaginaries and thinking about future societies and images of future worlds, this is where the sort of the utopian strand of critical theory, the attempt to build the world anew, has perhaps most in common with engineering or architecture or disciplines which have always oriented themselves towards trying to enact and construct future visions of society. And so, and there are really interesting, not that I've had any experience of them directly, but interesting collaborative, public, democratic, deliberative processes of thinking about future scenarios and future worlds, which involve a whole range of interdisciplinary contributions and and issues from law to engineering to politics to sociology and technology studies and so on. Brilliant, thank you. So we can pass over to any more general Q&A. I see Ali's hand in a sec. If you'd rather just put something in the chat and ask a question there, we can use that as well. But otherwise, before that, I will hand over to Ali.
Thanks, Matt. I suppose it's a bit of a continuation of the previous comment, but questions. Just thinking about the different modes of featuring. Julie and I actually worked on a project together well over a decade ago. And, you know, they are very different modes of featuring, although they are both thinking about futures. And I have a memory in my head of us all sitting in this massive interdisciplinary project team, and I drew a picture of a monster on a board, I think, and it was literally we were talking about monster models and what they eat to try and see if there was any complementarity in our data, and there wasn't actually in the end. So the projects kind of progressed quite separately, which is fine, and that often happens. But I think that, you know, if we're thinking of these interdisciplinary ways of futuring, we really need, particularly those that bring in the stories of everyday life and women's experiences and some of these more critical questions that also come from our archival work and other ways of thinking about the past and future as a sort of continuum. I think we really need to do that with intention at the start and sort of make different models from different models and different practices of bringing in that every day into those modeling practices and methods. But yeah, just to say that it is really complicated. And Laura, I just wanted to pick up on your point that Zoe Safoulis, who's an Australian critical scholar, has done a lot of work on container technologies. Really nice paper from a number of years ago looking at the way in which you can sort of conceptualize dams and other water infrastructures and materials as containers, and linking that to sort of feminist theory. So yeah, there's some interesting stuff on that. But yeah, just thanks all four of you for the presentations. It's lovely to hear the sort of points of interconnection and to think about how this might go forward in the future. Matt, you're on mute.
I don't know if anybody wants to come in response to Ali. It was sort of an intervention as much as it wasn't a direct question at anybody, but I think it was more if anybody just want to respond. But or alternatively, if there are other questions people want to raise at this point, feel free to dive. I think we're at numbers where we can dive in. So, Julien, I see you.
Yeah, I was just going to react. Yeah, it's good to see Alison again. We did work together on a project a decade ago, and there it was about representing. I think Ali was working on the water demand side, and of course, you know, how social practices and how people will use water in the future, you know, is definitely present in these modeling assessments. When you're evaluating a new dam, for example, that's going to be around for 100 years, you have to imagine, you know, how that service is going to be delivered and used for 100 years. And that's where engineers typically don't do as well. And we don't even know, you know, what the demand will be, how much water is going to be consumed. And because it depends on future technology, you know, and it is a kind of social data about how many people there will be and how they will live and their economic status. You know, there are questions of technology and institutions. You know, will there be single ministries, or there will be a water, energy, food, environment ministry? You know, what kind of institutions is water going to be licensed? Is it going to be? Are there going to be water rights? Are there going to be water markets? You know, what are going to be the future institutions? So there's so many different socio and political questions and assumptions that are made when you evaluate assets and investments for the future. And they do cost a lot of money. In the UK alone, since privatization, there's been a huge amount spent. And until 2050, the water sector is due to spend more than 50 billion pounds from now until 2050. So, you know, 50 billion pounds is a lot of funding. And, you know, allocating that funding in a way which is compatible with our, you know, with social political realities and with people's desires is a really difficult thing to do. And so I think, universities definitely have their role here in terms of advising governments and different regulatory and water management institutions like water companies about how we think they should be doing that, because it's definitely not an easy question, and it's not just a technical or economic question, it's wider than that. So, yeah, it's good to hear from Alison, who bridges that divide really in that interdisciplinary.
Laura, go ahead. You're muted. Yeah.
Sorry, I was muted briefly. Actually, to be honest, I have a bit of a question for Julien, because he talked it's very interesting to hear about the kind of different modes of futuring and the kind of considerations. And I just wondered if there was what kind of gender questions might you ask, and what kind of questions about the potential of conflict might you ask?
Yeah, it's definitely, when you imagine the future, well, in a way we always simplify by aggregating, right? So we'll aggregate water demands typically to a city or an agricultural region. At that point, you're aggregating so much that you can almost make, you'll typically just make gender disappear in that kind of assessment. Whether that's correct or not is a different question. I think, but the gender and kind of access to information, is almost more of a government and political aspect. When you consider that, these assessment tools are these technological tools, who has access to that, and who has input into the decision making, who has input into the, you use performance metrics to evaluate, these different packages of investments, and who has the influence and power, who has a seat at the table, who's able to say what are the criteria by which we should evaluate these investments. That's a very political thing, and I think gender is essential there. I think traditionally it's a few employees in the perhaps in the finance ministry and in the engineering ministries, who make those decisions. And my guess is it's rare that there's any kind of gender representation. But this effort of Future Dams was to try to imagine a world in which there's these multi-stakeholder coalitions, multi-agent coalitions, which are able to be involved in the co-production process to evaluate, to consider what are the futures that we want to consider, what are the options that we want to consider, especially how are we going to evaluate those different options, given that society is going to be investing millions in them. So I think there's definitely a huge amount of questions about gender and politics and representation and just the process of how this is done. I think what I showed is a kind of idealized version of it that we're trying to promote as a kind of multi-actor, transparent way of allocating funding for projects within complex, multi-sector human natural systems. But I think it's very far from reality. Certain organizations like the World Bank is really interested in these concepts. They're very interested in the concept of decision-making under deep uncertainty. How can you don't know the future? So in 100 years, it's not that we don't know the probability distributions of different variables like rainfall and water demand. It's that we don't even know, we have deep uncertainty. We don't even know like the structural components of the future. So we can't, it's not like you can just put probabilities on things and then know the future in that way. So there's definitely different international organizations that are interested in this, and they all have a different way of approaching it. But I think gender and social political representation are entering the discussion on this. And I think it'll complicate it further, but I think the debate about how to choose how we organize our water future needs to become more sophisticated, and academics have a contribution to make there. So
yeah, thanks. Were you going to come back, Laura, or because Ali's back in, as Ali's got her hand back up as well, so presumably on this, or do you want to?
Yeah, I was actually going to just kind of quickly respond, and I have a feeling Ali may make similar kind of, or build on my point maybe. But what I could say was that this kind of actually is very interesting to me, because it speaks to me about the kind of presence, if you like, of a gender data gap, that kind of gap that we have about the information we have about, say, for example, yeah, I think maybe Ali will know better about that. But gender data gap, I think that, and I'm thinking here of refugee camps. But what I was going to say about the data and peace agreement was that a lot of women said to me that had they been involved in the data and peace agreement, they would have actually been able to better ensure provision for internally displaced persons and refugee camps, because they had spent most of the war working with IDPs and refugees, and so they had a better sense of what their needs were, and they have integrated that into the agreement. I think even now, Berlin, I still have one of the world's highest numbers of IDPs, because it wasn't adequately addressed within the data and peace agreement. So this kind of speaks in a way to how we might think also about water. And so it's not just, in my view, it's not just about the representation of women at the table or just having a voice. It's actually about kind of like a very genuine of all the questions that we are, and thinking about how gender or feminism might actually matter to the way that we approach or tackle the problem as well. I think
Ali's nodding furiously, so I'll let her keep going.
Oh, I'm just nodding in agreement, but I actually had, if anyone wants to come in as a direct response to that, I was going to ask a question actually. So if anyone wanted to respond to Laura, jump in. Otherwise, yeah, I was going to ask a question for Laura, Chantal, and maybe for yourself, Carl, to go back to Laura's point really about that distinction you were talking about between climate change and water security, and that question you sort of posed to us is as whether that distinction matters for peace and security studies in particular, but I suppose we can also think beyond that disciplinary boundary as well. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I was just interested to hear your reflections, Laura and Chantal and Carl, on Laura's question.
Chantal, Carl, do you want to come in on those? Or Laura, okay. No, go ahead, Laura.
I was thinking it does make important, because I think, although I think climate change to me, to my inexpert kind of position, would be that climate change is obviously a bigger issue than water insecurity. But water insecurity isn't just a direct consequence of climate change. Water insecurity has more than one factor. So I think to me, in order to better respond to that, then we would be understanding water insecurity as something that occurs not just because of climate change. So I think it does matter how we frame it and how we understand those kind of distinctions. But I mean, I really did kind of pose that as a question to everyone, because I was kind of quite intrigued actually about it, because the knowing that agenda potentially to just climate change instead of maybe a broader range of sustainability and insecurity, environmental insecurity issues actually could limit what is actually done on the Women Peace Security agenda, because the Women Peace Security agenda is only making those connections between international gender, international peace and security, and climate change, rather than a broader range. So that's what I would make that point.
Great, thank you. Chantal, you want to come in? Yeah, go ahead.
Sure, I think it's important. I'm not a climate expert or anything like that, but I think it's important to sort of, as Laura was saying, like look at the water consequences and separating that a bit. Because when we think about like peace and security, in terms of climate change, the consequence of water insecurity of climate change, we think about like internally displaced persons and the things that happen as a result of that, you know, again, in like fragile and conflict affected areas, those things exacerbates a lot of those issues. So just thinking about the human aspects and the security issues that formulate as a result of that. So I think it's important in terms of looking at the climate issues and also like disaggregating some of the different consequences in water in particular. So I think that would be my thought.
Carl, I've got a couple of things I'm going to say as well, but
yeah, and I'm going to maybe turn my response into a question that I'll throw back to Chantal as well, because I mean clearly all these things are connected, and framing matters. I mean when I started work on environmental politics, I can remember feeling slightly sort of sniffy about the way in which everything tends to be framed in terms of climate change, and that overwhelms some other environmental issues, I think. But similarly, approaching water issues without a consideration of climate change is not feasible either. And in the way in which I don't come from a security studies or peace and security perspective, so the way in which this sort of international regime framing of this, I would go to the SDGs, which do have peace, water, climate in various interrelationships with each other, and water is reasonably prominent in the SDGs. But I guess I'm really interested in the way in which these things are framed by citizens, by activists, by movements, by protesters as well. And in South Africa, water at various points has become quite an intently politicized focal point for communities and movements to campaign around. So I'd be interested to hear from Chantal what the politics of water are like from that perspective in Liberia. I mean, and I wonder, I mean, would it be correct to say that if you talk to communities about water politics and water security, there's lots more to talk about than if you start talking about climate change? Is water more, it seems like a more obviously salient feature of people's everyday life experience than climate change might be. But I wonder, does it feel like water is a prominent topic on the political agenda? Are there movements and organizations campaigning and active on water politics in Liberia?
Yeah, sure. I would say, well, the thing is, there's always this fundamental question in the water world and in Liberia in particular, of like whether or not people should be paying for water. It's a fundamental right. Like I said, there are a lot of rivers and lakes and wetlands in Liberia, and people don't feel like they need to be paying for it. But they also recognize that they don't have access to potable water, and their water systems are exposed to a lot of diseases and things like that. And they expect government to be able to manage that. And so on one hand, there's always like a issue talking about whether or not if we do, start building up the systems, whether or not people will be willing to pay. And to be quite honest, whether or not people can afford to pay. It's not even well about the willingness, but like when there's so many other priorities. So that's one aspect. Climate change is actually a huge problem in Liberia. That's what people talk about a lot now, because like I said, there's two seasons in Liberia, dry and rainy season. And now the rainy season has been extended. It used to run from April to about September, but now we're seeing rain going into October and November and things like that. And people have noticed, and our rainy season is intense. Monrovia is the top, which is the capital city of Liberia, is the top 10 rainiest cities in the world. And so, I know a lot of times people talk about like Mexico City and their problems. Liberia has, especially Monrovia, has the same issue. So, water is a huge issue. It's always been on the agenda. Is one of the main things that was on the agenda post recovery. But there's so many other pressing problems in Liberia at the moment that it just a lot of time gets to be just a bullet point in terms of activism.
Great, thank you. I was struck by that point as well, in relation to the point about sort of climate change becoming everything and driving agendas. And I speak as somebody who's been doing climate for my whole career. But for example, and that's sort of global as well. And Julien mentioned, you mentioned the UK, right? What mapping out future water issues in the UK, the risk of it being driven. But what we know a little bit about already about how rainfall patterns in the UK are changing quite a lot. I was struck by Chantal's figure, which showed that that coastal area, at least in Liberia, gets 5 times the annual amount of rainfall that Manchester gets, just for local context. So that is an awful lot of rain. But here, where the patterns are changing, so that we've got, instead of just steady rainfall all the time, we're getting more intermittent, heavier downpours, longer dry spells. And that can be fed into water models in terms of how big our reservoirs need to be, and et cetera, but then that might obscure other aspects of how water is being used that aren't necessarily connected to climate change, because we see everything through a climate change lens. And those of us who teach it, like, we know that, right? Our students are confused all the time about what the boundaries of what is climate change. It's everything environmental. So that bleeds into those sort of decision-making systems, either like crowding everything else out, or by making everybody confused about what is climate change and what is not climate change. Ali, you were going to come in as well, or was that you?
Oh no, I popped it in the chat, just a little bit of a plug.
Oh, right, great.
Chantal's got a book chapter coming out next year on women and activism.
Oh, right, great, yes. Oh, right, that's
movement in Liberia related to water. So
brilliant.
Related to Carl's question.
Thank you. Are there any other questions people want to raise before we close? But otherwise we may be running out of people's patience. Chantal, do you want to say any last words? Given it sort of, or otherwise I'll wrap it up.
Just like to thank everyone for agreeing to take part in the discussion. It's really important to sort of put an interdisciplinary lens on water issues, especially in conflict-affected regions. So thank you so much.
Yeah, great. So thank you everybody for coming. Thank you to the 4 panelists. So they've got great presentations and a good conversation after. Thank you to Natalie for doing a lot of the legwork behind sorting out the Eventbrite and the Zoom and all of that. And I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed the conversation. It was very interesting. And we will, anyway, leave it there.